Hello, everyone. Welcome to the New School. My name is Cynthia Lawson, and I'm Associate Provost for Open Campus, the New School's unit for continuing online and professional education. I'm delighted to be hosting the culminating event of today's Day of Learning, this panel entitled, What is an Open Campus Beyond the Ivory Tower? Our esteemed panelists, whom I will introduce shortly, will draw from their own distinct experiences, approaches, and thoughts around higher ed, education generally, to really address that question and have a conversation amongst themselves with me and then also with you all on the framing questions around, certainly around Open Campus and a lot of the movement and innovations we're seeing specifically in adult education. I would like to thank the organizers. A special thanks to Morgan Ursary, Sephra Marks and Hearts, and their entire team. Priscilla Ewan, James Acevedo, who's also here, the live streaming team, ITAV, and facilities. And thank you all for coming, and thank you to those of you who are also watching us via live stream. If we have any Twitters in the room, we're using the hashtag Open Campus Network, and also in the program you'll see each of our Twitter handles. The four of us happen to be on Twitter, which was a very nice coincidence.
I never use mine.
Oh, there we go. So I am going to hand it over to each of our panelists who will, in a few minutes, give you a sense of how they are approaching this question and this conversation. Then I have prepared a few questions that I will posit with them. We'll have a conversation, and I encourage you all to start gathering your questions, since at the end we'll have time for a hopefully lively Q&A. So I'm going to first hand it off to Julia. I'm delighted to introduce Julia Folks, a professor of history here at the New School, where she researches and teaches about the arts, urban studies, and history. Welcome, Julia.
Thank you. I'm going to use this microphone. You can all hear me. In this very room, actually, I teach this semester with Mark Larimore a history of the New School. And Mark and I came to that from very different places. He's a professor of religious studies, and I just completed a book about West Side Story and how it can be understood as a story of New York. So we don't really talk about the New School in our own research, but we decided to come together to teach a course about it because where we were in the university and the kinds of things that we were talking about didn't seem to be what was part of the common few little myths that are taught are known about the New School. Its most famous episode may be as a place of refuge for scholars fleeing Europe from fascism, and the beginning of the university in exile in 1933 in the graduate faculty in political and social science. And if you don't sort of connect specifically to that part of the story, it sort of feels like all of a sudden you're not quite sure where you land at the university in general. The university began before then and has changed dramatically since 1933, began in 1919. And so we decided we wanted to build a larger story that encompassed all of the very different parts of the New School. Now that Parsons is the leading part of our university, it also we began to realize we needed to sort of understand how these parts fit together, or whether or not they do. In looking back at the history of the New School, then, there are a couple of things that are really important that I think speak to this moment of the open campus and trying to rethink what that is. The New School actually began as the New School for Social Research in 1919, and it began as a place in which it was a rebuke to universities. The idea was that universities were corrupt in a variety of ways. Universities were corrupted by degrees, which these people thought were, these intellectuals thought were a functional, bureaucratic, administrative tool that had very little to do with learning. It was also a rebuke to universities around faculty governance. A couple of the people that were involved in the founding of the New School were fleeing Columbia University over a battle with their president about a tenure decision, specifically one that had to do with politics of the United States entering World War I and professors who believed in pacifism who were then denied tenure because of that political belief. So it actually is that start in 1919 comes from lots of these different sort of ideas about education, that John Dewey was also a part of that conversation, but also the New Republic. In fact, the editor of the New Republic was one of the founders of the New School as well. So it was understood at that moment that what they needed was a new kind of school, hence the name, and one that was meeting adults. They didn't call them adults, they called them mature men and women. And meeting them at a place in which the idea was to learn about the contemporary issues of the day, to prepare them to be active in the world, to prepare them to participate in this sort of larger project of American democracy. And I think that that's a value that we hold dear still and have realized in many different ways. Another sort of important part about the way in which that idea changed throughout the 20th century at the New School is that by the mid-20th century comes the term adult education in the way that we might talk about it now. Continuing education is later still. But so mature young men and women become adults who are educated in an adult education, and the university at that point was still called the New School for Social Research. It didn't understand itself as a university, even though it began offering degrees. It was predominantly for people who did not want a degree, were coming off to take a one-off class for one semester, for a lecture, for a program. And one of the things that I think that's kind of key about that moment in the mid-20th century is that the New School had become a place in the city, a social, cultural, and intellectual hub of a kind. It offered a huge number of programs. There were a wide variety of very famous people who were offering courses, including the psychologist Erich Fromm, who was giving courses here for 30 years. And lots of other people that we don't necessarily associate with the school, but were in fact kind of the public intellectuals of the day, offering courses to anybody who wanted to come. But there was a way in which it was understood in the mid-20th century that intellectual work and life needed to be warm, as somebody called it, an administrator called it in the 20th century, in the mid-20th 20th century, that there was a way in which, in fact, this kind of intellectual work and conversation needed also to be social. And I think that that's an important thread throughout the New School's existence because of its name, the New School for Social Research. And there was a way in which to understand that social. I was just talking to Ajay, who's going to speak a little bit later, and we were talking about the term critical theory, and a lot of things that's also sort of attached to the school, particularly to the graduate faculty. But I would argue that the word social actually has meant far more in terms of the kind of education and the kind of environment for learning that the school wanted to inhabit. It wasn't for people who would come and go. It was, meaning in a degree program, it was here all the time. And you could come in directly off the street and participate in the ways that you wanted. So 10,000 people were here taking courses, not for degrees, but just because they wanted to be involved in a larger conversation about the current issues of the day. And those current issues ranged quite widely, from the arts to politics to languages to cooking eventually, all sorts of sort of different issues. So my final thing that I'll say is that this year is the 100th anniversary of John Dewey's Democracy in Education, one of the most important books that John Dewey wrote. And in fact, I think he thought it was one of the most important books that he wrote. And partly because he thought that these words were not one and the same, but absolutely necessary to each other, democracy and education. His ideas of democracy, his ideas of education have been enormously influential, and they are still talked about today. And yet I'm not sure that they are actually utilized around a lot of the world or around a lot of the country, although we think about this sort of learn by doing as a kind of easy way in which to wrap up his ideas. But one of the things that I think sort of critical about Dewey's approach to education is that he did very much understand it as a social, interactive, participatory exercise. It wasn't just you in a room reading a book. That's definitely a certain kind of education. But the education that he was talking about was the one that occurs with others, and that schools had to provide a certain kind of environment for a different kind of conversation, where you could begin to understand yourself as a public person in relation to others. And in fact, he believed that this idea of a public, that this formation, always in formation idea of yourself and others, was what was absolutely necessary to a functioning democracy. And it seems like an idea that we need to return to, I think, and try to think through how we do that even stronger today.
Thank you so much, Julia. Next, we're going to hear from Rob Kingians, who's the president and CEO of Cubed Education, an online content and education company.
Just to give you some context too on my background, which I think kind of ties to the panel today, is so I've actually probably one of the few people that has the opportunity to be in online learning for past 20 years. And where I started was actually not in academia, but more on the corporate learning side, where online learning started. So initially in my career, I was doing training for companies like IBM, who they had a need of, we have people spread all across the world. We need to figure out a way to do training effectively. And so got started there, but always felt that the real opportunity was in higher education with online learning. So prior to Cubed, I was actually at Cornell University working on their programs. And as I talked to a lot of other schools, one thing I recognized that led to Cubed was a couple things going on in the market. Is I noticed that for a millennial audience, which is typically 15 to kind of a 35 age range, is there's very few programs online that are designed for this age group. So usually you have degree programs, but when it's online, what a lot of schools are focused on is generally professional development, which is like a 35 plus age group, I would say. That's like executive education, et cetera. And the other thing I saw in the market, and this came from being more in the kind of corporate space, is that one thing unique is going on with the millennial generation between 15 and 35 is they care very deeply about following their passions. And employers, what they're struggling with today in the marketplace is they have a really hard time, recruiting millennials. And if they do recruit a millennial, they're lucky if they can keep them there for a year. And if you look at research of like, well, why are they leaving after a year? A lot of it comes back to passions. Is that if they feel like they're not in a job that's fulfilling, that has purpose, that ties what their passions are, they're going to leave and they're going to go to some other employer that will do that. So the opportunity we basically sought out to seek is that basically I think there's an opportunity to work with top tier universities as well as people that are coming from the brand world and industry to create programs for millennials that help them pursue their passions. So actually the very first program that we did at Cubed was partnering with the New School and the Parsons School of Fashion, which is arguably one of the top fashion schools in the world, and then also brought in brand partners. So in this case, we brought in a brand partner of Teen Vogue, and we also brought in contributors from brands in the fashion industry like Gilt and Etsy, et cetera. And our purpose was essentially to create an open online program that would give any student in this age group globally the ability to experience what the New School is about and what Parsons is about, learn about an area that they could potentially pursue they're passionate about. And so the programs we basically develop are online. They're meant to be very affordable, so they're priced under $1,000. And the students, when they get into it, if they have a passion for, say, an area like fashion, they can learn about this industry and they can learn about the different areas of that industry. And the goal for the programs we develop is help them figure out where their passion, their talent, and where the market is looking for people like them. And hopefully, with the students we have in these kind of programs, they're going to avoid that probably a lot of us have gone through as you spend 10 years kind of trying to figure out where's my place, where am I going to be passionate about. And so our kind of mission is to make these schools accessible, make these programs accessible, and hopefully be that starting point in their career journey, whether that means they're going to go to, say, a degree program, in this case if it was Parsons, or it's going to be their first start in an industry. So those kind of programs we develop, and another program we have, which is kind of parallel to fashion, is we did a program with Columbia University in actually sports. And sports is one of those other areas where people are very passionate about, and if you ask them, what would you like to do if you could choose any kind of career path, they'd say, I love sports, I'd love to work in sports. So in that case, we partner with Columbia University's actually #2 ranked sports management program. And again, we're exposing youth and millennials on what this industry is about. And what we often find, I find this in fashion too, is that a lot of people are passionate about these areas really don't understand how these industries work. And so our hope is that by exposing that to them, it gives them kind of hope, it gives them inspiration that they can do it. And then probably a lot of their programs that are actually part of like Open Campus and other programs out there, hopefully their next step is then they have the confidence to say, okay, now I'm going to take that step and I'm going to pursue this passion that I have.
Thank you, Rob. And I'd also like to welcome Ajay Singh Chaudhary. the executive director of the Brooklyn Institute for Social Research, BISR, an independent institute for critical education and research.
Hi. All right. So I should give an introduction. So Brooklyn Institute, we started out Brooklyn Institute for Social Research. This phrase keeps coming up. Interestingly enough, in our minds, when we were starting out, we didn't know this history that Julia just shared. I learned it along the way. We were thinking when we named it about the Frankfurt School, frankly, the Frankfurt Institute for Social Research. One of the things that they had always said they were going to do, but never did, was these sort of like seminars for everyone. They're like, we're not just going to be like stuffed up in the ivory tower. And like, if you know any of their work, it is some of the most stuffed up in the ivory tower that exists. And I say this as someone who loves that stuff. But what we did, starting 5 years ago, we didn't really know it was actually going to sort of become a full-time institution. Is a lot of us had met, an initial group had met at Columbia University, we were teaching in the core curriculum. We weren't 100% thrilled with some of the ways in which pedagogy was happening in the university. We also weren't 100% thrilled with or convinced that the university was the only home or should be the only home, especially for socially engaged and critical theory. And not just critical theory, but we do social sciences, humanities, we even do some natural sciences, but there needed to be a base for this kind of stuff outside the university that engaged working adults. I mean, there are interesting themes that definitely, I feel like, connect across this panel. So over the course of 5 years, and then especially in the last 2 years, we grew from, literally I just was like, hey, let's just do some classes at the back of a bar. We grew from that into now we have over 70 classes a year, 40 faculty. We have about 1,200 students in New York alone. We're also in Philadelphia and Jersey City now, and the next year we'll be in Denver, and we're actually starting these regional learning centers all across parts of the Midwest, which is an interesting story, which I'm happy to talk about maybe a little bit later. But what we really do is we take and create sort of graduate style or even not even graduate style, like sort of liberal arts seminars or graduate style seminars built around the lives of working adults. And one of the models, in addition to the sort of Frankfurt School for Thinking for Me, so that gives us our critical theory core, but one of the models for me is looking back at some of the kind of this sounds so radical, right? But they were called proletarian universities in pre-Soviet Russia, and then in early Soviet Russia, like they were, and it would be like in the factory, or it would be near it, and it would be all kinds of the most engaged education you can think of, but specifically not as we would think of it now as either like professional development or as like the classic German like Bildung, is it Bildung? Yeah, tradition where it's like we're raising up proper children. Rather, it's like, no, we're all engaged together, learning together, and like what is going on in the intellectual realm should be part and parcel of daily life, and vice versa. That the best work that we can be doing is to be built off a social base that is embedded, right? And this is one of the reasons I love the title that you have, right, Beyond the Ivory Tower, and that's always been a really core to our mission. So I'm not sure what else to say about it. I mean, we in addition to the classes, we're extremely labor forward. That's always been a core of our model. Everyone is a teacher, and everyone who is certainly full-time does administration and teaching, and everyone at least does some teaching. And we flag 70% of our revenue to go directly to teachers, directly to professors, which then supports their research. And we also sort of try to bring people together to work together. And we think this is incredibly important because we're not always convinced that there's always going to be a good climate everywhere to be doing this kind of work. I feel like, again, I'm hearing echoes with some of the early New School conversations. So the last thing I'll say about Brooklyn Institute is, in addition to the work we are doing, that we've been doing around pedagogy, we are also sort of taking this model and bringing it to commercial spaces, right? If someone wants to bring it in, that's totally great. I think we call this program, that program is called Onsite, and we have a new program called Praxis, where we bring together sort of either members or leadership in political organizations, labor organizations, nonprofits, NGOs, to sort of learn and get access to data, analysis, new ideas, and also to sort of convene in-person conversations. All of our stuff is in person, such that people can sort of coordinate and learn together. And we also have individualized study, which is our only thing that we do any online with. That's the only overlap there. So yeah, I'll leave it at that. And I will just say that that sort of like critical theoretical mission is there at the core, but it is much more engaged, let me say, than its initial practitioners were.
Thank you so much. So I'm going to kick off the conversation with a question that I think connects with Julia's remarks on Dewey, the idea of democratizing education. So we like to really, as we reflect on what do we mean by open campus, why the name open campus. So our intention is that open campus convey a commitment that that we're hoping that even more people will have access to what we teach and what we learn at the New School. At a conference a few months ago, I was struck by an interesting comparison that somebody brought up, which was that in continuing education, we measure success by how many people have access to our academic offerings, where in the degree space, often success is measured by how many people are not admitted, right? By having a low acceptance rate. But do you agree that the non-degree, non-credit space is really the place to democratize access to education? Or can you imagine this happening? Or have you seen interesting models in the degree space that you could talk about?
Look to me. Okay, I'll be the historian and go, yeah, obviously. I mean, the school started on that very idea, so of course I believe that it's crucial, actually. I mean, I think, it's sort of this question, and it seems like each sector sort of that we're talking about is a kind of a responsibility for education, and I think of that as a very public duty, one that can be done in the private sector, in a nonprofit sector, and of course by sort of the institutions of education. But I think thinking beyond our doors is critical in all three sectors, it seems to me, that the institution alone isn't the place where education happens. That's certainly a Deweyan thing to say. But I think that it can be a spur and a start, but it goes outside of that. And just a couple of points about where the New School fits. One of the interesting things about the school is that it began as a school and deliberately not a university. Then it got graduate degrees, and then it got undergraduate degrees. And now it's a primary undergraduate place, but we've done it backwards. I'd like to think that that actually helps us think through the education that we're doing, that we hold on to that backward style, backing up into the credentialing by remaining committed to what the idea of a school is. The second thing is that I work I'm housed or work primarily in the program that is the first undergraduate degree program for mature adults in the entire nation, was housed here and began here in 1943, partly brought on by the GI Bill, which provided funds for returning soldiers to finish their BA degree. That degree has gone through a wide variety of sort of different definitions and experimentations, one of which sort of ended up evolving into a traditional liberal arts college, Eugene Lang College. It's part of our offerings as well here at the New School. But the thing about our bachelor's program is that it started, and even though it went through sort of various things, remains committed to the idea of self-design. That is, that with intensive advising, that is in conversation with people, and particularly with faculty, students can figure out what the education is that they want, and that they can find their way through the curriculum to build that degree, whatever that degree might be, is actually the content is formed by their particular passion. Talking again about passion. And I think this is key. One of the key factors about what sort of education works in the non-degree space is, I think, following people's interests. And I think we have an obligation to sort of follow people's interests. We can try to guide them other places, but there's a lot of reason, I think, actually, to think through what's interesting now. Why? That's sort of our obligation as intellectuals, I think, and teachers is to try to answer that, where it might have come from, where it's going.
Ajay or Rob?
Right. Just a couple things you said. So one thing I find interesting, this is my experience when I was at Cornell, but also with what we're doing, is one of the most common questions that we get from prospective students is, what are the mission requirements, and am I allowed? And what I find interesting with these programs, so like this fashion program we're doing with the New School, we have over 4,000 enrolled students in this program, but consistently one of the biggest questions, especially from a global audience, is perception of that there is an ivory tower. And that it's almost unbelievable to them, whether it was at Cornell or it's even New School or even Columbia program we're doing, is this perception of that I have to be from an affluent background, or I have to meet certain requirements. And so I think the thing that's encouraging to me is, as we open this up, is that it exposes a whole world of people. And I think especially when it comes to like the fashion program we have, is I see all kinds of students where I can see that their family, they may not have had family members that have advanced degrees. Education may not be important. They're super passionate about fashion. They're actually quite aware of Parsons, and they just, for whatever reason, assumed this is not reachable for me. I could never attach myself. And so it's really encouraging things to open up. I think non-degree programs open this opportunity to really kind of encourage and inspire people that they can do it if they're disadvantaged and they don't have that option. And I think by them taking those kind of programs, then it opens up the door for them to then think broadly of like, okay, well, then I could potentially do a master's program, or I could take the next step. So I think that's the opportunity. I think your other question, Stad, on the degree side, I think they're starting to be opening up on degree options, and I think there's some interesting things going on in the marketplace with degrees. On my side, obviously, I think about online, but I think it's, again, a way of how do you make degrees more accessible, and how do you break kind of that ceiling of only a few people get admitted. And unfortunately, I think my observation is I think the ranking system has helped perpetuate that, because it's almost, if you want to get highly ranked, you have to deny a whole bunch of people. And so hopefully we start to see that start to change and open up and be more accessible.
So, okay. So yeah, it's great questions. So none of our classes grant credit. And we also have no requirements. So like all comers. We do charge a fee. It's relatively low, especially given in the context of what other things cost. And if anyone can't pay the fee, we reserve spaces, about 3 per class, for students to do a pay what you can, right? And sometimes it'll be $5, sometimes it'll be 50. And you know, it's a tough balancing act. And you know, this is maybe a different use of the word democracy, but to me, this is part of democracy. It's a tough balancing act because we got to pay our people, but we also want to be including as many of a broad social base in our classrooms as possible. One of the things that happens when you do this and you teach the kind of courses that we do is that we actually, what you were saying before about like, well, we can sort of guide a little here but take a little here, is we do have something very similar, right? We often ask our professors like, oh, well, what do you want to teach? Then we know what historically people have been asking for, and we sort of try to like match these up. And we also, sometimes we will in fact build from the classroom and be like, oh, you know what people actually kind of need that we learned from the classroom that we didn't know is this, is like X, Y, or Z. And actually some of the programs we did this fall were built directly like that. So yeah, we've really avoided the degree thing. The only place where we are actually even exploring that idea is in our individualized study. And that's actually to help some of the people. We get people from community college, for example, is one of the sort of small segments of population. We get people, you know, mostly it's working adults, as I said. So mostly people don't need the credit, but sometimes people do, and they're coming from a place where I really want to, I'm like, fuck, man, I really wish I could give that to you. Or like someone is, for example, a union, they need it for their like union professional development kind of thing. And we don't do professional development, but I would like to be able to help them there. So things like that, I think, are ways of sort of a slightly different angle of thinking about democracy or democratizing education. And then there is a sort of democracy in the classroom. We don't do like the horizontalist thing. Like we do, in fact, have teachers and we do have students. But, you know, I always give the spiel at the beginning of every one of the classes I do, and I know a lot of our professors do this. I'm like, look, guys, no one's grading you. Like, you're not in the university. We never stream it. We never have recording devices. We don't, like, no one's there. Like, no one's grading you. No one's judging you. And if they are, they have no control over your life. Like, so, like, you can have some of the access to that kind of rigorous education you can get in grad school with none of the anxiety, hopefully. And, like, if I can actually deliver that, that to me is, like, a great tool for democracy.
Great, terrific. Earlier this evening, it seemed that the four of us were in agreement that the phrase disruption of higher ed is somewhat overused, to put it lightly. But it's a useful way to think about those projects that are maybe trying to push higher ed in new ways or new directions, or even if you're not within a university thinking about education for adults. Could you share what is the most inspiring disruption you've learned about recently? And if it wasn't inside a university, could you imagine it taking place within a university?
I'll let somebody else take this one. I mean, I'll say something.
I should not be the first person to talk about this.
Okay, guess it's me.
Yeah, go to Rob.
So I wouldn't say it's something new, but I think what's interesting in the education space, and with our company, I attend a lot of conferences where the disruption of higher ed is generally a theme. But I think what's interesting what's happening in higher education is one of the biggest things that were happening, and a lot of it started here in New York, is things like boot camps. So in the marketplace, a lot of companies are looking for software developers. And so what sprung up was these boot camps that a student, in almost the antithesis, they almost try to stay away from attaching themselves to universities, is basically in a few months you learn how to be a coder and you're going to get this high-paying job. And what you're seeing as very disruptive, innovative. And it was actually just last week I read an article from Bloomberg where they're saying a lot of companies in Silicon Valley now are avoiding people that came out of boot camp, and they're looking more for people that came from computer science programs that have a little more liberal arts. And I think it also ties to the passion thing, that they actually intended to go into software development because they wanted to, not because they were going it for a job. But that's an interesting example of what's happening is a lot of schools now are starting to take a boot camp model and bring it inside. And another example that I observed too is like the whole thing of like the maker space, if you've heard of that, or innovation labs, which generally was like a very startup-y thing of having these labs where people could play with 3D printers, or they have mentors. And now a lot of schools, including I think the New School, are now starting to create that environment. So what's interesting, I think that there's companies that in the education space that are kind of doing things that are considered disruptive and new. But what I see is a lot of them eventually get adopted and translated into the university. And part of the reason for us of why we partner with universities or our company is that I'm a believer that a lot of people think that the university is going to get disrupted. And I just don't see that happening. I think sometimes the disruptors will get disrupted by the university once they test it out for them. So, but I think those are kind of interesting things going on as you see this in the past few years. A lot of these predictions have not come true, and actually universities have picked up on the good ideas, and the bad ideas, probably wisely have not adopted them.
I like that. I was going to say when we were talking about this question earlier, I don't really feel like I have much to say about disruption because I'm a historian. So, that isn't language we use. And partly, I think, in some of the ways because of the answer that Rob just described, they don't tend to be that disruptive in the long term, perhaps, these motions or these movements or whatever. But my example for this question is maybe a little bit completely out of left field, but I've been incredibly impressed with the Bard Prison Project. And the Bard Prison Project provides a Bard college degree for people who are incarcerated and serving in prisons in New York State, 6 different prisons in New York State. And one of the reasons I think of it as disruptive is because it sort of is returning, it seems to me. It is a clear reminder of the value of education and liberal arts education. 97% of people in prison are coming home. And, it's a question of whether or not we as the public, make an investment in people to be the neighbors that we would maybe prefer, or the neighbors that have a lot more opportunity than they did for whatever reason that got them into prison. And I think that what's interesting about the Bard Prison Project is that it's completely overwhelmed with people who want to be in it, in the program. They take anybody, regardless of prior education. Only 17% of the people coming into the Bard program have a high school degree, and there's absolutely no remediation. So they give them a grammar textbook at the moment that they are accepted, and it's sort of up to them to scramble to the standards and figure out how to meet the standards of Bard College. And they come out with a degree that I think takes them into a very different life, perhaps. That obviously requires public money, probably. And I think, but what I like about that project is that it reminds us again, I think, about education as a public good, and that universities can be a part of that. Private places, private corporations can be a part of that too, but it's a public sort of decision to make that kind of investment in the people and people who are incarcerated, for instance.
Cool. Yeah, I totally.
It's an amazing.
Yeah, the Bar Prison Project is amazing, and we actually this past year started something we call the Community Initiative that is sort of inspired by that, where we've been working with housing insecure facilities here in the city. And actually the first pilot of it was in halfway houses for people who are coming out of prison. And absolutely, I actually could not agree more with what you said at the end there. There's no way that those kinds of programs will ever be self-funding. There's no market-based solution for that kind of education. So my view on disruption, I don't want to like throw any bombs, but you know, I should be pretty true to my self. Yeah, I actually there's a lot of I don't like to use the word disruption, and occasionally people are like, oh, Brooklyn Institute, you guys do a lot of disruption. And I'm like, I don't really think so. There's a really funny story. Bill Bennett, who was the Secretary of Education under George Bush the First. I love how we have the first now and things like that. But anyway, under George Bush the First, he actually wrote about us in his book, and like years ago, he put out a book called like "Is College Worth It?" And bizarrely, he must have had some like intern or something put us in the book, and he was like, "This is how you can cut humanities and social sciences and critical stuff, all this kind of bullshit. Like, you can cut it out of your school, and something like Brooklyn Institute would take care of it." And I was like, that's disruption, right? I was like, no, buddy. Like, we are demonstrating how institutions and how the state is failing education, is failing, especially a democratic, critical education that is necessary for a healthy civic life. And I have to disagree. And I do think there's a great deal of disruption happening, and it's happening from the university, generally on the labor market. And I actually do see dramatic transformations happening in the university, where you have a greater and greater concentration of fewer and fewer voices being broadcast. So I think in 10, 20 years, it's not like places like New School is awesome, like Columbia. These places are not going to go anywhere. But I do think that there's going to be a real shift at the tier below and the tier below, and especially at the state level. I think you're going to see a lot of prepackaged courses, a lot of curricular what's the word I'm looking for? Constriction. Yeah. And this concerns me greatly. And this is actually one of the reasons why we do what we do, because we are not convinced that there's a good home for this work necessarily always within the university.
Great segue into our next question, which is, looking back, universities were founded as communities of scholars. Increase in tuition is a huge driver in what you're describing, Ajay, of that kind of constriction of curriculum, vocational orientation. What is the job that I'm going to get if I engage in these courses or in this degree? Do you see that stark line between the vocational, professionally driven curricula and the kind of learning for learning's sake? Do we need to pick one or the other? I would be interested to hear from Rob and Ajay. Do you feel like when you started where you're currently involved, did you have to pick one priority over the other? And Julia, in the classroom, do you think about that question, or the kind of those needs from your open campus students versus the degree students who are maybe there for different reasons? In open campus, we don't necessarily see that stark line because we do think that if we can construct pathways of various courses, various ways of navigating the university, perhaps we're tackling both. But would love to get your thoughts.
I mean, I think one reality, and as we were talking earlier, I grew up in Canada in different education system, but I think a lot of times too, this is a very American thing too, is that I think with tuition, there's no doubt. I mean, if you see almost every other week of, it's like an epidemic, especially the audience we're doing, millennials that are like ridden in debt and paying back. So because of that, especially it's relative to the price point. If someone's paying $10,000 plus hundreds of thousands of dollars for education, it's almost an imperative that it has to align something to a viable career path. so that they get some kind of ROI and can pay that back. And I think that partly for like the programs we do, it kind of motivates me is that in some ways it's a little bit ludicrous that a high schooler going to college is going to make a life decision and choose like a degree program or a school when they're still trying to figure out what actually they want to do in life. And so I think with some of the things we're talking about with open campus and online learning, et cetera, if there's more affordable options that students can kind of try to figure that out before they make a big life decision and a big financial decision as well, I think that kind of helps. But I think definitely there's a driver in the market, and in conferences and things I go to, there's very much a push around this term of competency-based training, which is really what it means is, are you going to get something that an employer is going to recognize and they're going to hire you for? And so I think to your point, I think you can do both. And so I think if there can be programs that can tie to the interest of a student, that's why we're very much passion focused, is start with something your interest, your skills are at, learn the competencies that are tied to what the market is looking for, and you kind of can have your cake and eat it too. But I think, as long as tuition's not going down, it's going to be kind of imperative that it has to somehow tie to what employers are looking for. Otherwise, this epidemic of debt isn't going to go away unless the government bails everybody out, which is unlikely.
Certainly not right now. So yeah, we that's good. Right. Sorry, I threw myself off by doing that. I shouldn't have done that.
About the president-elect.
No, I totally did. You saw that happening.
Yeah.
So yeah, we've always been committed since the beginning. Actually, one of our co-founders, Abby Kaluchin, who's a professor at Ursinus and is also the associate director of Brooklyn Institute, she had a line. It was something like, "We'll teach you political economy, but we won't teach you how to do your taxes." And the thing is, like, we've always thought, and it's something I say in our classes too, is like, we don't promise you a better job, and we also don't promise you the revolution, which in the sort of, I guess, in the space outside the university, a lot of people sort of promise one or the other of those things. That said, part of the reason why we are so focused on this, on sort of, it's not only theory, we do a lot of empirical stuff as well, but the reason why we're focused on those sorts of pursuits was that was the kind of research we also wanted to be supporting, and we do think there should be a sort of better integration of pedagogy and research. And B, frankly, there was just a lot more space there. Like there are a lot of people doing practical and practicum educations, and very few doing sort of. Very few. I'm really surprised, actually. And as we start these regional programs, I'm even more surprised how few people have ever been asked, some of these sort of classic political philosophy questions, like handed a dialogue of Plato and been like, what does a just city look like? Like, very few people have actually been asked those questions. And our view is like, the more people who you can get to be having just asking that is a fairly radical position to put people in. And so that's kind of more where we're working. But I don't necessarily think that it has to be inextricably separated from more practical skills. And that's, I think, something really nice about what you guys are doing here.
Yeah, so, I teach history, so doesn't lead to anything. And I don't, in terms of a job. There are very few jobs that come directly from learning history.
We're looking for American and European historians.
Except that one. I'm not claiming to prepare people to be a historian as a job. I hope I am preparing people to be active, thoughtful citizens and ethical people in the world. And by knowing the past, you can hopefully figure out where you're going and how to put yourself into a larger sort of sense of the world. And the thing about this question, I think, about the professional, vocational versus the kind of learning for learning's sake, is that the defense of the humanities that I feel like we are going through all the time, defending why it's actually a good thing to study philosophy and history and these things that don't have a specific professional outcome and that you pay an enormous amount of money for. We're defending the humanities all the time by saying it is about curiosity, it is about ambiguity, it is about thinking about what is moral, it is figuring out who you are and who you are in relation to others. All of these kinds of things that are very ephemeral, and that are ultimately not tied necessarily to a vocation, but I think are tied to a life that is full and interesting and can go a variety of places, right? That's the kind of traditional defense of, like, you may not be the first one hired, but you'll be the one hired that ends up you moving very fast past others because you're sort of capable of thinking and being in a different way. But I think that the question to ask, it seems to me, and I'm perfectly comfortable with all of those answers and defenses for the humanities, as well as sort of trying to tell people their internships at these museums and, all of this too, right? Where you can sort of find the life of the mind, if you will, or whatever you want to call that, humanities vision of the world outside of a university. But it seems to me what we also need to do is ask the question of people who are teaching management and teaching sports management and teaching fashion and teaching those things. What also are you teaching that is about curiosity, that is about passion, that is about what is a moral life in the fashion industry, that is about what does it mean to be an ethical worker in sports management? I feel like we should be turning the question around to those industries as well, and to those teachings as well, if we really believe that these things coexist, and I think that they can. But I guess what I want to push back on is that it's always learning for learning's sake that is the problem. It seems to me there's also problems or challenges on the other side, and that those two things can actually would benefit from being in conversation on both sides of that.
I was going to add too, and I think it's what from my previous thing I said about why does Bloomberg have this article about people that go to boot camp and learn coding, is that sure they may be able to code, that doesn't mean that they are a well-rounded person. It doesn't mean they did it for the right reasons, etc. So I think all these things are important, and blending them together is a necessity.
I'll just say on the learning for learning's sake front, actually, when a couple years back we wrote a paper on Brooklyn Institute, and one of the things that we included in there was that it can look like an art for art's sake or a learning for learning's sake thing on that side. I'm actually always pretty suspicious of things that are like art for art's sake. Has a pretty gnarly history if you look into it. And one of the things that we thought about when we were making these programs and as we run them now is that it is a kind of autonomous space. It is a space for a kind of free development, but there's no outside of society, right? So it's not learning for learning's sake. It's carving out a space with a little bit of breathing room. I talk about this a lot. So just having breathing room to be able to ask some questions, to be able to read some books, to come together, to learn, to talk, to be guided, but also to sort of be able to then come back and be socially engaged, this sort of sense of autonomous sort of removal, which I think often does get associated with sort of ivory tower-ism, if you will, right? We try to sort of let that autonomous space exist in the world such that actually people can be more engaged. So things can rise out of that in a way that it's not for its own sake, but you can't sort of plan it.
Thank you. I guess I want to check in with the audience to see if there are any questions. Great. We're going to pass the mic for the benefit of our live stream audience.
I was wondering if you might share with us if there is a financial model challenge. Are you funded entirely by what students pay, or are you dependent on outside funding? And just an addendum to that, because we did have a small allusion to the president-elect, are any of your programs potentially compromised by what you're hearing in the education arena of what the president-elect feels about education?
Oh boy. She's ready.
Should I do this one first?
Yeah.
Yes and yes. So yeah, Brooklyn Institute is Brooklyn Institute, we call it BISR on the inside, so I'll just BISR. So BISR is a weird nonprofit. We have mostly operated off of our fees, and a lot of me and some of our other administrators we get paid for our teaching time, but not all of our administrative time. So as we expand, especially into these regional centers that'll have to be more funded from philanthropic and probably not the state, frankly, and we'll get into that in a moment. We are trying to build out that traditional nonprofit development side. If anyone wants to talk to me about that, please do. But yeah, it's not in our experience. There is no like easy market switch. Like, so we do solve the labor problem, we think, pretty well. Like, people do really get paid pretty well for what they're doing, especially in our program. But it means there's very little left, and we have to be very creative. We partner with other cultural institutions and businesses to get space. We do a lot of things where it makes us very nimble. The nonprofit world loves this phrase. It makes us very nimble, but it also makes us very precarious. And to your second, but yes, we are building out that side to make up a perennial deficit, and there's no way of doing it. I mean, no, we actually have a very, very minor amount of we're getting by, but it's not well. And we do self-sustain. We are sustainable, and that was one of the things that we set out to do. That maybe was a little bit different than some of the other groups that were doing what we were doing back when we first started. But yeah, we definitely really need input from, it would have been the state, but who knows. As to the question about Trump, frankly, which is sort of the elephant in the room everywhere, yeah, actually, we had our faculty meeting. We have about 40 faculty, about 20 around here in New York City. The rest of them are across the country and even other parts of the world. We had a faculty meeting last week, 2 weeks ago, and I was like, hey, guys, there's not going to be probably NEH, NSF, NEA money coming in anytime soon. So, let's get that pipe dream out of our heads real fast, at best. And also, frankly, doing the kind of stuff that we do, we already get some pretty gnarly stuff from people, and we think we'll get more of it. And we're extremely worried about what the coming administration will do to projects like us that are frankly quite obviously arraigned against that, and are building some of these programs, these regional learning centers, is clearly a response to the threat that Trump presents, and we are happy to present that threat. Sorry, I've been
Yeah, no.
From our standpoint, I think as much as I think for what we're doing, I'd love to be a nonprofit. The reality is that a lot of schools don't have the funding to get these kind of programs off the ground. So our business, we're a for-profit entity that essentially has investors, and we make an investment up front. So in a program like the fashion program we do at New School, there's a pretty hefty investment we make up front, and then we make basically money back and share with our partners based upon the tuition that the student is paying. For that. One of the advantages of our business model, because we are open access programs that don't have enrollment caps and they're accessible to anybody globally, is that allows us to enroll a lot of students in these programs. So that's how we become a profitable company and invest in new programs, which I think it'd be great if there's other mechanisms to fund these kind of programs. But I think at the moment, our types of companies serve a need that kind of, I think Cynthia and I work together on a program, is that we're able to fund a new initiative that we both believe in, but because of the structure of our company, we can then fund those kind of programs.
So my question is, what are your views about MOOC providers that are playing in this space for continuing ed, no credit, and they're at no cost, they're low cost, and when they partner with universities for credit and offering a low cost option towards a degree?
I mean, I can speak to that a little bit. So when I was at Cornell, I was actually there in the group that leads online learning when the whole MOOC phenomenon happened. And so I kind of lived through that, and actually Cornell joining edX. I think a thing unique I find with MOOCs is that the secret is that a lot of schools and the MOOCs aren't really necessarily attached to it. A lot of it is very individual faculty driven. So it's not necessarily organized by the school. So I think it's serving a need, but I think it's not structured. And so I think for even our company, we contemplated, offering that type of solution. But the question is, if you bolt together these courses and call it a certificate, is it really cohesive? Was it really thought through, et cetera? Although there are some that are thought through that way. So I think what I've seen, though, that the positive side of MOOCs is, even when I was at Cornell, is it kind of opened up everybody's eyes to how do we reach people? How do we be more accessible? What is this online thing? How do we do it properly? And so I think that's a positive outcome of it. I think they're all still trying to figure it out. If you follow any of the MOOC providers, they're constantly changing their model, it seems like, every other month. So they haven't quite got it figured out yet either, I don't think.
And isn't that because they are, in fact, quite expensive to make happen? I mean, it's not clear. The profit is not yet clear.
If you squeeze the labor, you can produce it for free.
I was going to comment on that. So what I find interesting with the MOOCs, and I see it also with other adult, what? Oh, sorry. So MOOCs, MOOC is an acronym that stands for Massive Open Online Course. Some of the most well-known providers are Coursera or edX, and many of the Ivy League schools were the first ones to kind of commit to, we're going to have one of our star professors create this free online course that anyone in the world can learn. And originally the intention was we're going to reach audiences that don't currently have access to our education. But in reality, the demographics of people completing the courses is very aligned and certainly intersects with people who already have access to higher ed. So it's not necessarily bridging a divide in terms of access or digitally. But what I find interesting with the move towards credentialing around MOOCs is also I see in some adult education providers who kind of pride themselves in we're offering skills that maybe will lead to jobs. People don't need credentials. What they need are the skills or the portfolios or kind of the resume builder. But now they're coming to universities trying to find the credentials, trying to associate themselves with that, the degrees or the credits. So in that way, the MOOC is a little bit like it started with a certain goal, and now it's become a wonderful repository for universities to figure out, well, what if we gave access to our students to all of these free courses, and in some way we're able to credential their learning?
Yeah. So one of the things, so I'll say two things. One about something we do, and something about the view that at least the founders of Brooklyn Institute had about MOOCs. One is that we actually do a lot of online stuff. It's just none of it's the teaching. We use a lot of technology, and we do a lot of, podcast projects like events, videos, things like that, but we do those things to get people into a room to learn together. And it's not because we're like weird Luddites or like some kind of like spiritual fetishists or something. We don't think there's anything magical about it. It's just sort of a better model, and it's been proven to work. I think this is like with the MOOC model. I think, Cynthia, this is sort of what you were getting at. Like mostly, it's been shown that it works for the same people you can hand a textbook to, and that is about like a decent percentage of the population in places with decent public education. So like you can just hand you've met kids like this, right? There's some kids you can just hand a textbook to, and they come back and they're like physics geniuses in a week, and that's great. But the thing I fear about MOOCs, and this sort of goes back to disruption actually, is sort of like when you have what's the big Harvard one, like Michael Sandel, is that the what? I think that like 10, 20 years down the road, maybe 30 if we're lucky, that's the one political philosophy lecture in every state university in the United States, and the sections, right, the little study sections, are taught by professors being paid maybe like $2,000 a semester, and it's a great way to disrupt and make a ton of money for very, very, very wealthy people. So that's what I think about MOOCs.
Any other questions? I was also monitoring our hashtag to see if we had any questions from our live stream audience. Oh, there's a hand up.
Hello. So I teach at a local university, and recently I had some questions from students I've never had before in my teaching career, which is they've basically asked me, hey, I took a look at your syllabus or the description, and I'm wondering if I should sign up for your class or if I should sign up for, X module, which is kind of like the boot camp type module. And it really startled me because this class I teach is data visualization, just for context. But it startled me because it got me thinking that students are starting to become more discerning when it comes to them basically like choosing their educational path. And this strikes me as an opportunity, maybe, or maybe an inevitable consequence where established universities are starting to lose a grip on their source of power and revenue, which is credentialing and degrees. So I'm wondering if you think that A, is this a good or a bad thing, but B, like, do you see this as an inevitable consequence of the kind of alternate or open educational models that each of your programs are describing? Like, do we see, where do traditional institutions of higher education stand in this equation?
Would you feel comfortable sharing how you responded to the student?
Yeah, I actually took a look at the link to the module that they sent, and I thought it looked pretty good. And I said, we're going to learn some of those things in this class. Others we won't, but the goal of this class is not explicitly to give you job training. It's to understand the context of data visualization and data analysis for the purpose of advocacy and for the purpose of public presentation. And that was a tension throughout the whole semester, which was like, we learned some things, but not all the raw skills that are presented. And, I didn't really engage with the student much beyond that. And I think the other interesting detail is for that one student who didn't come in, there was a waiting list of like 80 for the class, and the class was capped at 40. So there's no shortage in demand. It's just the question startled me because I never even thought of that before.
I think, I was going to say, Cynthia, I know you've thought about that.
Yeah. I mean, from my perspective, I think it's a missed opportunity for schools. I think there's a lot of providers out there, and I probably know the provider that the student was asking about that I think may have been a former MOOC. But I think it's an opportunity where if these kind of courses can be opened up to students, I think, too, it's a unique thing because we work with a lot of millennials, is they're very much thinking about how's this going to correlate to career path, what's credential, et cetera. And so I think if universities can adopt and create those programs and kind of democratize, like we're talking about, that I think the university wins. And I think Cynthia said that some of these providers, which I've heard of too, are now coming to universities and say, will you endorse the credential? And the big reason for that is that the reality is for employers, they trust and they respect the university more than a startup that's been around for 5 years. They basically expect that if it's coming from university, there's some kind of rigor, some kind of assessment around it that validates this. And so I think if universities can take that challenge on, I think it's going to make a lot of other companies nervous. But I think they're basically capitalizing on an opportunity that universities aren't for the most part, I think.
Go ahead.
It's such a great anecdote, so thank you for sharing. And there's a lot I could say about it, but briefly, so one of the things I love about the New School is our commitment to small section sizes, and we rank highly in terms of smallest section sizes in undergrad programs across the university and across the United States. And what I love about it is it's so easy to be able to respond to the student the value that they're going to get by enrolling in the class versus in the online module. And that's that kind of dynamic learning environment. One can talk about flipped classroom, Khan Academy kind of made this famous of what if they go and watch the module, but then always return to a place that is essentially, as I was saying before, that community of scholars that the university was founded on as a principle. So that flipped model, I think, is something that universities need to embrace. I think that I'm committed to, and I'm most excited by the conversations that we have here at the New School with colleagues of where we're really constantly reflecting on the value that we are bringing to students and we are bringing to education generally, and we're bringing to conversation, that our value isn't as the expert in front of the room just lecturing, but it really is in that daily learning engagement with the student. So I think that high touch is perhaps what's absent in the student who chooses to not go in your class. On the other hand, I think that there could be some really interesting models in how students could construct their semester via a variety of learning engagements, and they could choose according to their own interests and priorities. And so I know of a university that allows students to assign however many credits they want to each class, according to how valuable they think or they want that class to be to their, how much time they want to commit to that course. And so having much more flexible structural models like that within universities, I think would really respond to those students' interests.
Yeah,
Sure.
Do you want? I'll just say briefly about the credentials issue, because I feel like sometimes we can be taken for like again, the sort of Bill Bennett mistake where he thinks we're trying to like replace English departments and trying to replace economics departments. That's not what we're trying to do. And in fact, the credentialing thing is like one of these places where I think the most about that, where I'm like, I would love it, frankly, if credentialing as a sort of sign of like election, frankly, like we're eliminated from our society altogether. On the other hand, I totally depend on credentialing to actually run my own organization. So this is a tough one, and in fact, I depend on the university to produce PhDs. We don't produce PhDs, right? So we depend on this to exist, and it's a really tough one, especially when you're thinking about the decreasing support for this from the state for universities. I think especially about public universities, but this also affects private universities as well. I mean, they're tied into the federal government at so many levels. So it's a real catch-22, and or whatever. It's a conundrum, and it's again, it's one of these things that can only be solved through probably solutions that exist beyond merely the education sphere.
Yeah, I have this. I thought your answer was great to the student, actually, too, and it only makes me think of a program that we have in our bachelor's program, which is, as I said, for adults, and we have a program of prior learning where we people who come in who have spent a number of years as a successful person out in the world who learned something, they can actually create a portfolio about that learning that is then evaluated by a faculty member, and then they're given credit for it. And one of the key parts, and I love that program, I used to coordinate that program, and not only are you sort of just amazed by what it is that students have learned and who happens to be your students, but it's a clear example that learning happens outside of a classroom. It happens outside of university. I think what that program provides, and then more broadly what universities provides, is a reflection on that learning, right? That it's not just I learned this, but or I know this, but I learned this. How do I describe what it is that I learned exactly? Why is it important? How do I know I learned it? All of those kinds of questions that I think are kind of John Dewey questions are ones that you have to actually prove, right? You have to write a fairly long, lengthy defense of what it is that you know. And that seems to me what the university provides that, a module probably doesn't, or an internship probably doesn't, or 3 years in advertising doesn't. But when you come into this prior learning and you're sort of forced to go through this you elect to go through this process. But what students tell me that go through that process too is that, wow, that was incredibly hard. Like, I know marketing like this, like the back of my hand. I've been incredibly successful. But to tell you what it is that I know, holy moly, right? And that seems to me exactly what should be occurring at a university.
Ooh, more hands. Okay, we'll take 2 more and we'll wrap up.
Thank you. Hi. I just wondered if the framing of is credentialing the problem or is the right one, and or a problem, and whether the question of our degrees, 4-year, 2-year, the degree as a challenge versus credentialing as a challenge. Because it seems to me that one of the critical concerns in an economy that is constantly accelerating in change, that people can easily make a really bad investment. And so anyway, I'm not sure if I'm being clear about the question, but I just wondered if there's a reframe that's needed there. So,
good answer.
I think I understand the question. I was actually recently at another conference where the topic was around this term of competency-based education. And a lot of it was around that, if you look at it from the employer standpoint, they don't know how to digest what a degree is that's practical to what the employer has. And so I think one of the challenges that universities have, and some are starting to do it, is basically how do you unbundle or how do you dissect what a degree is, or is it a degree, or does it stack up towards a degree? Because definitely, you know, and the other side that, you know, I get the opportunity working with brands and employers as talking to them, that is a real challenge, is they don't know how to interpret what a degree means and how that's practical to what they're actually looking for. And again, I think it's an opportunity for universities to kind of figure out how to figure that out. The other challenges too, depending upon what the student's learning, there's a lot of learning where there's no standards at all. Of, you know, one school may call it this thing, another school may call it that. So I think that's a challenge that's not going to get solved in, you know, probably the next decade, but it certainly is a challenge.
I'll add to that. I saw the founder of a startup called Degreed give a TEDx talk, and he started his talk with a slide, your typical commencement slide. Students very happy in their caps and gowns, throwing their cap in the air, and he asked the audience, "What is wrong with this slide?" And his point was that the problem that he identified and that Degreed is trying to solve is that the celebration is in this culmination of kind of the completion of the degree. And the idea with Degreed is that it's a new way of being able to capture all the various things we learn, that we shouldn't just stop and celebrate graduation, but we should then figure out, well, what are we going to learn the following day? What did we learn the morning of? What did we learn during a trip? Really capturing learning in a wide variety of ways that doesn't necessarily just tie with degree. So I think that is an interesting experiment, I guess, that I'm closely following to see and kind of figure out that question. There was another hand raised.
Hi. Kind of lead on to from that question. So so I'm an architect. And also I do career coaching on the side. And so I've been, on that said, about 20 years I've been mentoring. So a few years ago I started career coaching. But I like that one-to-one so much. I started volunteering at International Rescue Committee, IRC, and helping out the refugees. And I noticed that they're in the camps, wherever they are, and going through the UN system and what have you. So is there, as you're talking about online or cater to refugees or UN or that aspect? So I wanted to tell my clients from Africa and a variety of different places that these are offering and the way to the university system and what have you.
First of all, good work. Second of all, and this is actually, it's really funny because it came up 1 week ago. We decided that some of this stuff was pretty recent for us with the regional learning. And one of our professors is in Southern California, near where a lot of refugees are being settled, the ones who have come to the U.S., certainly from Syria. And she was extremely interested in doing regional learning, built either around our community initiative model or around the regional learning center model, specifically for refugees. So I actually, if you just want to like chat with me later, I would love to talk more.
I think too, I've totally forgotten the name, but I think that there a student in my class who was very inspired by the University in Exile moment of our history hooked me up with an online provider that is trying to provide online education into camps. I don't know. That requires some money and some technology, obviously, in the camps themselves, too. But I've just totally forgotten the name of that particular mission, but I can try to find it and send it to you if you give me your contact.
And within Open Campus, we do have a whole suite of offerings that we custom design with organizations. So perhaps not necessarily reaching the refugee, but we would approach it by training the trainer model. Which is a kind of a very comfortable space for us. We have many colleagues who consult in the nonprofit sector and do that. So it's thinking about the models of executive education, but with a nonprofit or NGO audience, which we find very interesting and inspiring.
I speak for our company. So our company, we talk a lot about how do we how do we identify students that have no financial means that are great for a program? And one of the advantages that we have with asynchronous online programs is that although there are costs to fulfill that, they're much lower than, say, like on campus. And our struggle is if we do a scholarship program, then you need resources to figure out how do you decide who is qualified or not. And one of the things we're doing interesting with the sports program we're doing at Columbia is we recognize that there's a lot of professional athletes out there that have foundations where they've already identified disadvantaged youth, and they know that they don't have the income, et cetera. And so we're actually starting with that program to basically have them identify students that are qualified, and they can get into this program for no cost whatsoever. And so from like our standpoint, we'd love to talk to you because we're looking for now partnering with organizations that have identified it that we can trust, and obviously they validated these students can't have it. And that's, I think, one of the great things about online education is that although there's some cost, it's a cost worth, for our company, we're willing to pick up that cost because we feel that that's part of our mission. And if another organization like, it's the UN or it's refugees or it's a foundation has figured that out, I'd love to, I don't know if our programs align with this audience, but I think the more that we can figure that out, I think that's actually providing open access, and also it's, I think, social responsibility of education as well.
Okay, we're going to leave it there. Please join me in thanking Julia, Ajay, and Rob. We would love to continue the conversation, so I'd like to invite you all to join us for a small reception on the 7th floor. So you can take the elevators up to the 6th floor and then walk up a flight of steps, or there's also one elevator on the 6th floor that then takes you up that additional level. Or you feel free to come up, and if you want to exchange comments, or we can just, go up there. Thank you all for coming, and thank you to our live stream audience for tuning in.
That was fantastic, you guys. Thank you.